Welcome to the Core Women Podcast, the place for women entrepreneurs, authors, and self-starters looking to build community and gain valuable insights through expert interviews with women at the top of their game. Join your host, podcaster, producer, expert coach, entrepreneur, and author, Dr. Summer Watson, as she aims to inspire and empower you through these candid conversations. Lean in and embrace the journey. It's time to start the show. Here's your host, Dr. Summer Watson.
Welcome to the Core Women Podcast. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with a powerhouse of self-advocacy and innovation, Neelu Kaur, a keynote speaker, executive coach, and author of the transformational book, Be Your Own Cheerleader. Neelu is dedicated to helping underrepresented voices thrive in the workplace with a background that blends business acumen, social psychology, and mastery in neuro-linguistic programming. She has worked with Fortune 500 enterprises to foster self-advocacy and innovative thinking. Beyond her corporate expertise, Neelu is a passionate yoga teacher of 15 years and a lifelong student of Ayurveda, embodying balance in both professional and personal spheres. Let's dive right into this and welcome Neelu.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you today. So let's dive right in. Before we really dive into the professional aspects of your journey, if you could describe your journey in one word to this point, what would that word be and why?
I think the word would be cheerleader. And that is because I didn't realize it at the time, but every step of the way, I had to be my own cheerleader.
Oh,
I think during all the career transitions and things like that, I didn't realize that that was my word. And now that I have my book, I definitely think it's cheerleader or cheerleading.
okay. Now let's talk about that because I think that's an interesting framework to come from. What happened or why did you find that you really had to be your own self-advocate? You really had to be your own cheerleader. Tell us a bit more about that evolution and why you think that, or what happened in the midst of your journey.
Before grad school, many layoffs and downsizings. After grad school, similarly. And I think the one that was the most stickiest and is the stickiest in my mind is 2013. And 2013, I was escorted out of the office by a security guard as if I was a criminal. And it was just downsizing. And, we all go through it, but I think I had gone through it in different ways numerous times. And I had this moment where I was like, it's not me. I am smart. I'm intelligent. I have creative ideas. It's literally that I don't know how to advocate for myself. I don't know how to speak up. And many of us that come from collective, we-based cultures, we really struggle with raising our hand and saying, no, that was my idea, or interrupting people. Like there's a higher deference for respect and authority. And so based on where you're from, you might struggle with advocating for yourself. And it's not even if you come from a collective culture, you could be raised by people from collective cultures. You could be extremely introverted. You could be a techie, because I work a lot with tech folks who are software designers, developers, and they are subject matter experts and they love what they do. And yet they don't want to raise their hand. They don't want to bring attention to themselves or their work. They just want to do what they do. And that I've learned is a recipe for disaster in corporate America.
Interesting. We'll get more into that. So let's talk about your interests and how they evolved in social psychology, self-advocacy, and innovative thinking in the workforce and everyday life. And I know that there's got to be another story behind this, right? Or many stories. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So where do we begin? Okay, well, if we travel way back in time, way back to young little Neelu, I wanted to be a therapist. And as I was going to school, my folks were like, it wasn't a profession that was like encouraged, especially as an Indian, as immigrants. It was like a doctor of like not a therapist, but like a doctor, engineer, or a lawyer. And so they were just like, no, that's not, you have to go to med school and you have to do all of these things. And that's really not your role. Your role is to get a 4-year degree, get married, have kids. And that was really like this box that they thought I belonged in. And they thought like Indian women belong in. And it's not just them, it's like the culture that they've come from. So I then went into business because that's what I knew. I was like, okay, my dad's a businessman. So I studied business. I went to NYU Stern School of Business. And I realized there that I absolutely do not belong in business. So I minored in psychology and I was out in the world and I was working in consulting and all that. And I just felt, for me, coming back to psychology was what I wanted to do. And I think it was an easier bridge to come back to social and org psych because I had been in the workplace and I had been working in training and leadership development already. And so I thought, okay, this is a great way for me to get back to what I really want to do. I really, at that point in time, had no idea how it was going to unfold. I didn't know that I was going to become an executive coach and then also a keynote speaker. I really, at that point, didn't know. But that was sort of the impetus for the social and org psych. I wanted to get back to psychology because that is a true calling for me.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. And there is a story there, right? The conditioning of that. And so, how can we step away from that conditioning when we know that there's going to be pushback too? Because from the people that we love and care about. So, how did you do that as you began to listen to that inner knowing and understanding there might be a little pushback here, but I need to do something that I'm really passionate about, or that's my calling more so?
Yeah, there's actually two stories there. So when I told my family that this is what I was going to do, my dad was like, "No, you need to go back and do an MBA. Like that's what you do. That's what you do to earn more money." So when I made that decision, I was my own cheerleader. I said, "I'm going to do this no matter what because this is what I want." And when I got to Columbia, which is where I did my master's, I that was the first time I think I felt like, "Oh wow, like this is what it feels like to be truly aligned with a decision I made and feeling like you're in the right place." Like those 2 years at Columbia were like the best 2 years of my life because I literally felt aligned every moment of every day of those 2 years. And then I will tell you another story that's really interesting is that before I got to do my master's, I was working at a consulting company and there was this woman and she was beautiful, like just breathtakingly beautiful. And she was facilitating a meeting and the way she owned the room was just like, wow. I saw her, I was like, whatever she has, I want. And I just kept looking at her from head to toe. I'm like, I wonder how she's doing what she's doing. It was a room full of men and she just had everyone eating out of the palm of her hands. And she just was very assertive and yet just really knew exactly how to guide the meeting. And so a few minutes later, I saw her in the bathroom afterwards, and she was putting on this fire engine red lipstick. And I stared at her, and I couldn't stop staring at her. And then I said, "Hey, can I ask you a question? I just saw you facilitate this meeting. Like, how do you do what you do? What do you do? Like, how do you do what you do?" And she said, "Oh." She turned around, she looked at me straight in the eyes, and she said, "You must do this." And she told me about the program at Columbia, social psychology. And I realized in that moment, like I did go home and I did do research and I did submit my application very soon thereafter. But it was that moment where I literally felt like it was an angel speaking to me about this is the next step for you in order for you to get to wherever else you want to go.
Wow. So I guess these points of reflection, these points of intersection, right? Where it was like, wow, that's it. That's speaking to me. And I need to find out, talk, ask questions. Again, going back to self advocate. I love these stories because how you evolved along your journey and what were some sticking points that were like, okay, that really resonated with you, or I really need to look into that because you felt that significant alignment with whatever you were going through at that time, which brings us to the next question. Many people struggle to advocate for themselves, especially in the workplace. What are some of the practical steps anyone can take to become their own cheerleader?
I think one thing that you can think about and that anyone can think about is that when we work in groups and in teams and in organizations, we are a part of a team and we also need to be apart from the team. So, in order for us to be a part of the team, there's a lot of work that we have to do that's really we based, which is like our shared deliverables. Your language even changes, how you bring people in and thread them into the conversation, and how you manage a team. So, that is really about sort of the we side. And then there's the I side, which is when you're in a performance review conversation, you really have to talk about yourself, your accomplishments, your credentials. And the way I like to visualize it is a speedometer in a car, the we and I dial. So, given who's in front of you, you adjust the dial. So, if you are in a meeting with your manager or a leader in your organization and it's time for you to advocate for yourself, even if you are not comfortable talking about yourself and you live in the we space, in that moment, it's like having that awareness, knowing that you adjust, you're still authentic to who you are, but you can adjust that dial in that context for X amount of minutes. We can all adjust and flex for a certain amount of minutes, even if it doesn't truly feel authentic to ourselves.
I like that you said that, because there are many times that we do need to flex, right? And I think that some people can get lost in that and say, well, that just doesn't feel good. That doesn't feel like me. And I just don't want to do that. But there are times where we have to adapt to a given situation. And there are ways to not give up ourselves wholly in that, but just for a couple of minutes to adapt reasonably so that we can move our way through the experience. And it might be also that experience might lend to that didn't feel horrible, and I can do that the next time. And here's how I can do it maybe a little better. So I love that you say that. I also really appreciate that you touched on you are entering and part of a we environment, a culture. Language begins to change. Behavior begins to change. The we and the I are different, look different. And I also love that visual that you just gave us about the dial between the we and the I, or the I and the we, right? And so you have written a book, Be Your Own Cheerleader, which focuses on self-advocacy for underrepresented voices. What inspired you to write this book, and how does it reflect your personal journey?
So I think I mentioned in 2013, that was like the stickiest one of the layoffs. And I think in that moment when I was being escorted out of the building, I was like, this is it. This cannot happen again. Why is this happening? And it sort of led me down this path of deep exploration as to what was going on, because it was happening to me, but it wasn't happening to many of my friends or my
Mm,
colleagues. So I didn't understand what was going on. And so as I went down this path of exploring research and understanding the different nuances of intercultural dimensions and how that might play into action. And I also started, this is after grad school, and I started coaching and I started being involved in different coaching programs. And through these past years, since that was 2013, I've coached and trained so many professionals, and many of them, the common red thread as to why self-advocacy can be so challenging for some of us is because many of us come from Asian cultures or Latin cultures or African cultures or cultures where it's very we based and all about the group. And then we're in North America, which is very I based and it's all about yourself and your nuclear family. Whereas in we based cultures, there's like you have this whole community and network, and it's all about you have to maintain this facade for group harmony. And when you are taught and behaviors modeled to you in that way, you really don't know. You don't know the how to raise your hand and speak up because you don't want to draw attention to yourself.
yeah.
You know, I remember when I was younger, my parents would actually say to me, this isn't our country, so just you have to stay under the radar. Don't bring attention to yourself. So when you grow up hearing these nuggets and you see your parents doing these like behaviors that also are kind of like staying under the radar, you assume that's the way to operate. So when I did graduate from undergrad and I started my first few jobs, I thought I needed to be a hard worker and my work would speak for itself. And that was not the case. And so I learned very quickly that you hear the loudest person in the room get the most accolades, keep getting those promotions, keep getting those raises. And that was not me. And since then, and I've worked with so many people now, I realize like many of us, it's simply because we weren't trained. We weren't taught how to do this. It is a skill. Many of us learn it from our families. Many of us learn it as we're being raised in a culture by certain people. So I think it just really depends on your upbringing. But like I mentioned earlier, you could be extremely introverted,
Yeah.
or you could be neurodivergent, or you could be raised in a small town in the US in the South where it's taught to be humble and it's a small town. So you're told, you don't want to bring attention to yourself. So there's many nuances to it, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we just don't have the skills to speak up.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you're talking about here because it touches on so many different nuances, right? It touches on how you were brought up, the conditioning, culture, just so many things. And I can relate to this in so many ways. There's one, being a woman, two, being raised by a mom, a single mom who was raised by her parents. Your value is to get married and that's it, right? But you've got to marry this type of person. And she said, I don't want to raise you that way. But her conditioning still kind of filtered into some of the things that, I learned, like, all right, you want to be polite, you don't want to speak. But then she also said, hey, you can do anything you want, go out and try and do this and do that. So it was like this balancing act, right? And so I think about just my own personal experiences of having this multicultural and multi-ethnic background, coming from a mom who's Armenian and European, a dad who's Filipino and Mexican. I mean, that's so many different cultures, so many different things that I'm being taught. How do you separate from all of that as a woman, be multicultural? So many different things, and not just from a personal perspective, but as you begin to separate from your parents, how do you do that in everyday life, and how do you do that in the workforce? And I love that you've written a book about self-advocacy, because we don't learn those skills. And we watch people and we learn from people modeling for us. And so I think your book might be really helpful in so many regards to so many people, because it gives you the steps. And I always feel like when I go into, let's say, a sermon or a talk, and if I'm left inspired, that's great. But if they don't give me some step to start with, I feel let down, because those don't have to be the exact steps, but they could be a guideline to what I can do. So tell us about some of the steps that you give in this book that will be really helpful for folks.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like when I wrote the book, I was told from a publishing perspective, write about what you know. And because I come from this collective culture, it was like, okay, so the book is targeted towards Asian and South Asian women. But I think one of the things that has been the most surprising to me is the feedback that I've gotten from people that don't fall into collective we-based cultures, but they're leaders in organizations that were like, I had no idea that my people were struggling and why they struggled. So your book highlighted some of those things, and the onus is on me to hand the mic over to them more in meetings. Just because they're quiet doesn't mean that they're not engaged. Just because they're quiet doesn't mean that they don't have these bright, brilliant, innovative ideas. And so my book is really about strategies to use if you struggle. Like, how do you be part of the team and apart from the team? So there are actual tangible strategies of things that you can do, including the we and I dial. It's really helpful because it's not prescriptive. It's like you can pick up the book and you can find the chapter that works for you, but there's a strategy in each chapter. So you walk away with like a tool that you can go practice. Because I think it's really important to walk away with something that's tangible and real, and you can go and implement it the next day at work or with your partner.
Brava. I love that. That is so helpful. And I think this is going to be such a great asset to so many people, where they can just use that, keep that on their desk. And also for those, as you mentioned, leaders, right? Because the way that I see it is we all have the potential to be great leaders. And it's just a matter of the modeling, learning how to be your own self advocate. And so books like yours are really helpful to be those guides to say, hey, you can do this too. And here's some ways that you can try. So thank you for writing this book. And I also want to ask two more questions. As someone that is deeply rooted in yoga and Ayurveda, how do these practices influence your approach to coaching and self advocacy? And where do you find that balance in your life between always working and then bringing it back to center?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll be honest, I think we all know the saying that we teach what we need the most. So I definitely can attest to that. I feel like I can overdrive and just run myself to the ground, and then I need to scale back. So I think the practices have helped me personally, but also in a coaching environment, or even when I am speaking or workshops. When we think about a person and an individual, there are things that are very unique to you, and there are things that are very unique to me. And I think Ayurveda is a holistic healing system based in India, where each person is this unique being, and you learn about your doshas, these energy channels, and like when you are the most alert, awake, and aware. And so you find these time periods where you are the most alert, awake, and aware, and then you put activities that are high cognitive functioning activities in those buckets of time. You eat according to what you need for your own individual constitution. So I think there's a lot of individualized pieces there that I think often in Western medicine, it's kind of like one size fits all. And I think that's where for me, it's like, okay, I am different from you. I am different from my husband. He needs different things than I need. I need different things than he needs. And so we need to start asking ourselves, like, what do we need? Because ultimately we know the answer. And I think what do we need in this moment is a question that I think we can all ask ourselves. Like, what do I need in this moment? When I feel frazzled, when I feel overwhelmed, I ask myself, what do I need in this moment?
That takes me to my last question. And you already gave a great tip. But my last question is, as we come to the close of the interview, if you could leave the listeners and leaders with one tip to create environments that encourage and support self-advocacy, what would that tip be?
The tip would be practice everywhere. Practice everywhere. So, for example, if you don't want to eat Thai food and your partner's saying, let's go have Thai food, in that moment, an act of self-advocacy saying, no, I actually feel like eating pizza or Indian food or whatever. Sometimes we think self-advocacy is this huge, big thing. And the thing is, it's not. It's in our everyday activities. And if we can practice this, flexing this muscle at home, we can absolutely practice at work where it might feel a little more daunting. So if we are going to practice in the environments where it's safe and it's easy so that you flex that muscle. So then when you're in a meeting and it feels like a bigger flex, you've still built the repetition.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining me on the Core Women podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You can follow Neelu Kaur on LinkedIn at Neelu Kaur, Instagram at neelu.kaur, and on Facebook at neelu.kaur01.
Thank you for joining us on the Core Women podcast with Dr. Summer Watson. We're so glad you're here and would love to connect more with you. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Core Women, and on Twitter at Core Women 1. For more about Core Women and Dr. Watson, visit corewomen.com. Want more support and resources for amazing women like you? Great! Join Dr. Watson and Jen Fontanilla at the Life, Love, and Money Collective, a Core Women production that aids in understanding the key traits that might be getting in the way of living a life that you are absolutely passionate about. Connect with Summer and Jen and find out more at thelifeloveandmoney.com.